Hello everyone, and welcome to a new video. Today I'm taking on the second and final 1950s project in my Sewing Through the Decades series. It's a lovely little blouse design that was patented in 1955 and printed by McCalls. There are 3 collar options for this pattern, but today I'll be following design A, which is the high-necked bow style. The instructions for this pattern were a bit intimidating at first, especially after these super simple skirts that I made in my last video, but they broke down surprisingly well. Which means you shouldn't judge a pattern based off of its instructions, unless it's a pictorial review pattern. Those can all go die. There are 6 required pieces for this design, which I went ahead and pinned to my fabric. This pattern is a size 16 and made for a 34-inch bust. And the mock-up fits surprisingly well without alterations, so I didn't have to make any additions to the pattern, but I did end up adding a 1/2 inch to the side and shoulder seams so I could stitch them as French seams. They're just a bit more durable, and this fabric is light enough that I could easily get away with it. And after cutting out the front, back, collar, sleeve, and back neck facing pieces, I also cut out 2 strips of 2-inch wide bias binding, which will be used for tie and seam binding later on. With everything cut, we can dive into the instructions. And the first instruction is to stitch side darts into the front and waistline tucks along the lines marked on the wrong side of the fabric. And this is to be repeated with the darts and tucks on the back panels as well. So to save a lengthy trip to my sewing machine, which is like 3 feet away, I went ahead and marked and pinned both of these panels at once. Also, I made sure to clip all the notches before removing the pattern. They were really important for the collar and facing placement later on. And the marks were transferred to the fabric with a water-soluble fabric marking pen, in case you were wondering. I had a few people in my last blouse video point out that the tucks in the back panels should be darts, but they are marked and depicted as tucks. I think the blouse look at the waist was more popular in the 40s and the 50s, and this helps add to that effect. All the darts and tucks were ironed, and then it wanted me to join the shoulder and underarm seams of the blouse, and I did half of that. The shoulder seams were stitched as French seams, so I sewed them with the wrong sides together, clipped the seam allowance, then ironed and re-sewed the seam with the right sides together so the raw edges are encased and hidden away. This isn't a recommended seam finishing method on the pattern, but it just so happens to be my favorite. However, I did not sew up the side seams, at least not yet. Sewing up the side seams makes stitching the facing and collar into position way more awkward since it's more difficult to manipulate the blouse and get it flat. I did it according to the instructions for the 1940s blouse, but this time I'm doing it my way. So I skipped to the next step, which involves the collar. It says, place collar right sides together. Stitch along outer edges, leaving notched edges free between circles. Clip seam allowance at circles, trim seamed edges, clip corners, and turn right side out. So I pinned the pieces together with the wrong sides facing each other, then stitched around them, leaving the specified points open. All of the corners were clipped, then I turned it right side out and used a pencil to get the corners nice and sharp. It was ironed, and then I had to make a loop. They say, for loop, cut a 1 by 3 1/4 inch strip of fabric. Turn under 1/4 inch on long edges and press. Now fold so that turned in edges are even and edge stitch. Form loop by bringing raw edges together and base to center front neck edge of left front. Right sides up and raw edges together. I actually made a mock-up of one of the other blouse variations, so I was kind of blindsided and confused by this step, so I just followed their instructions to the best of my ability, and this is what I ended up with. I pinned it, along with the collar, to the neckline of the blouse. See how easy this is to do with the side seams open? It's so much better. And they said to base this in place, but I used my machine to stitch it down. Then the back facing gets sewn onto the flat edges of the front piece as it is notched. And this is done because the front piece also secretly forms the facing, except it isn't a very good secret. It's pretty obvious when you're making it. The front section of the bodice, as well as that back facing piece that was just sewn on, is flipped outward so the right sides of the material are facing each other and all of the notches are matched. And it's pinned across the neckline and then sewn across the neckline. And this is why notches are so important, because this is pretty difficult to do without those as guides. Now some of you might be watching this and thinking, Angie, it doesn't look like you pinned that with the right sides together. In fact, it looks like you pinned that with the wrong sides together. And if you are thinking that, then you are correct. I had to rip this out and redo it, but here it is sewn properly. Now all the edges of the facing are turned inward, and they say to tack this at the hem and shoulder, but since this print was busy enough to hide the stitching, I chose to slip stitch the entire edge down. I have a few lightweight cotton blouses without fully sewn in facings, and they always get messed up in the wash. I'd rather spend 15 minutes doing this during construction than have to iron it every time I want to wear it. And now, with the collar complete, I finally sewed up the side seams, and once again I sewed these as French seams. To finish the lower edge, they say, turn up and stitch a narrow hem on remaining lower raw edge of blouse. And they show machine stitching for this step in the diagram. This is the first time anything has been hemmed by machine in this project. It's so exciting! I ironed the hem first, then pinned it before stitching as close to the edge as I could, creating a very neat, very narrow 1/4 inch hem. Okay, now it is time for sleeves. Their instructions are, ease in fullness of top sleeve, run a gathering thread between notches. Usually this is done after the sleeve is constructed, but I guess it can be done earlier. I just did this by hand with the contrasting thread and left a long tail of thread so I could adjust the gathers later. Then it says, join underarm seams and turn under lower part on facing lines, based close to fold edge and press. I marked the facing line first with my water-soluble marker, then I sewed up the side seams as French seams. I ironed the facing inward at the facing line, then turned unward, that's not a word, then turned under the raw edge of the facing and stitched it down. The reason the sleeve has such a deep facing is because it turns outward to form a cuff, and this prevents you from seeing the seams or the wrong side of the fabric. But I did find it interesting that they called it a facing instead of a hem, despite it being part of the sleeve pattern. I wonder what makes it one or the other. Is every hem a facing? Who knows? The next step is pin sleeve to armhole of blouse right sides together, matching notches, underarm seams, and sleeve circle to the shoulder seam, adjusting ease. I lined the notches and seams up first, then fiddled with the gathers until it matched the length of the arm side. It was sewn on with a 1/2 inch allowance, and I used the bias strips I cut out earlier to bind the edge. Again, I have every intention of throwing this blouse in the washing machine and dryer, so any sort of finishing I can do to make it hold up better, I will happily accomplish. For closures, they say make worked buttonholes by hand or machine in right front of blouse. Yes, you heard that correctly! They're machine buttonholes, not bound buttonholes. I love this pattern so much. These were sewn on my Singer Heavy Duty, and I went over each buttonhole twice to make them more sturdy. Before cutting them open or sewing on buttons, I stitched snaps at the neck edge and below the button closing. These were marked on the pattern, and I thought my thread would be less likely to catch on things if I sewed them on before the buttons. I'm easily infuriated by my thread catching on things. I used water to get rid of the markings for the buttonholes and snap placement, then I snipped open the buttonholes and used fray check to make them a little less prone to fraying. The buttons were sewn onto the right front in line with the buttonholes, and I picked vintage green buttons for this. I thought that would make it more versatile than black or a brighter color like orange, but I can always swap them out in the future. And since the buttons were a bit boring, I sewed them on with contrasting yellow thread to liven it up. And that is it! The blouse closes with the buttons and snaps down the front, then the collar is pulled through the loop so it overlaps and looks like a bow, without the mess of trying to tie an actual bow. I do question my fabric choice for this a little bit, and the fit isn't well suited for my body, but I had fun making this. The instructions were really good, and it only took 2 mornings to make. I think it's something I will wear a lot in the summer, since all of the colors in this fabric and this pattern make it a pretty versatile piece in my wardrobe. I'd actually really like to make the C variation using a fun quilting cotton in my stash, so keep an eye out for that. And I also might have a sneaky 1950s bonus project coming up in the form of a dress covered with stingrays. Not literal stingrays. I think they would be hard to sew through. Didn't they do that on Project Runway? Or am I just making things up because it's very late at night? Anyway, my dress is just fabric with stingrays on it. If you're interested in seeing that, then you should subscribe. And if you enjoyed this video, then giving it a like and a comment really helps me out. And if you're interested in access to dozens of exclusive videos and supporting my channel in general, then there will be a link to my Patreon down below. Thank you so much for watching, and I will talk to all of you very soon.